I pretended to support my brother's wedding to his gold-digger fiancée, then dropped the evidence at the altar. My brother Jake was always the golden child, star athlete, honor roll student, first to graduate college. When he brought Meredith home for Christmas, my parents practically started planning the wedding before dessert was served. "She's perfect for him," Mom gushed, watching Meredith laugh at Dad's terrible jokes. Finally, someone who appreciates what a catch he is. I wanted to believe it. Jake deserved happiness after his messy divorce from Sarah, who'd cleaned out their joint accounts and disappeared with her yoga instructor. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding his life, working 16-hour days and avoiding relationships entirely. The betrayal had gutted him. I'd found him crying in his empty apartment, surrounded by legal papers and divorce documents, wondering what he'd done wrong. "I gave her everything," he'd said that night. "I thought we were building a life together." When he finally started dating again, we were all desperate for him to find someone genuine, someone who would see past his success to the man underneath. The guy who still sent flowers to our mom on her birthday, who coached Little League on weekends, who'd driven 14 hours straight when our cousin had been in a car accident. But something felt wrong about Meredith from the moment she walked through our front door. She was beautiful, charming, and said all the right things. Too right. Like she'd rehearsed every conversation. When Jake left the room to grab drinks or use the bathroom, her smile would drop for just a second before snapping back into place. She'd study family photos on our mantle with an intensity that made my skin crawl, asking detailed questions about every face, every vacation, every milestone. "Who's this distinguished gentleman?" she'd ask, pointing to our grandfather's portrait. "He looks so successful. What kind of business was he in?" "Real estate development," Mom would answer proudly. "He built half the shopping centers in town." I'd watch Meredith's eyes light up as she filed away another piece of financial information. The red flags started small but multiplied quickly. Meredith always had an excuse when the check came at restaurants. "Oops, forgot my wallet again." She'd order the most expensive item on the menu, lobster, aged steaks, premium cocktails, then claim she wasn't that hungry halfway through. Jake would laugh it off and pay for everything, plus leave a generous tip to compensate for her barely touched meals. "She's just forgetful," he'd say, when I mentioned her convenient amnesia. "And she's been stressed about work lately. You know how demanding marketing can be." Her job was another mystery that grew more confusing the more I paid attention. She claimed to work in marketing for a tech startup called Digital Dynamics, but her schedule was completely random. Sometimes she'd be in urgent client meetings at 11 p.m. on a Sunday. Other times she'd be completely free all day on a busy Wednesday. When I asked about her company's name or what products they marketed, she'd give vague answers about digital solutions and streamlining business processes, before quickly changing the subject. "You know how these tech companies are," she'd say with a dismissive wave. "Everything's proprietary and confidential. I've signed so many NDAs I can barely talk about what I had for lunch." I tried looking up Digital Dynamics online. No website, no LinkedIn company page, no business registration that I could find. When I mentioned this to Jake, he got defensive. "Not every company has a huge online presence," he said. "Some businesses prefer to keep a low profile. You're being paranoid." But paranoia felt justified when I started noticing other inconsistencies. Meredith claimed to live in a downtown apartment, but I never saw her car parked there when I drove by. She said she was from Oregon originally, but her accent would slip occasionally, revealing hints of something more southern. She knew detailed information about our family that Jake swore he'd never shared with her. "How did you know our grandmother's middle name?" I asked her once after she'd mentioned it casually. "Jake told me," she said without missing a beat. But when I asked Jake later, he looked confused. "I've never told anyone Grandma's middle name. Hell, I barely remember it myself." The turning point came during Easter dinner when I overheard her on the phone in our guest bathroom. I'd gone upstairs to grab aspirin from the medicine cabinet when I heard her whispering urgently behind the closed door. "The wedding has to be before his grandmother dies," she hissed into the phone. "That inheritance won't transfer if we're not married. The lawyers were very clear about the marriage clause in the will. Just keep playing sick until then, and we'll split everything 60-40 like we discussed." My blood ran cold. Jake's grandmother had been battling pancreatic cancer for months, growing weaker with each chemotherapy session. The family business, a successful chain of hardware stores built over 3 generations, and the family property were set to pass to Jake when she died, but only if he was married. An old-fashioned clause from the 1940s that everyone had forgotten about except the estate lawyers who'd mentioned it during a recent will review. Except Meredith somehow knew about it. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart hammering as she continued. "I don't care what you have to do. Delay the diagnosis, lose the paperwork, give her the wrong medications, whatever keeps her alive until I get that ring on my finger. We need 6 more weeks minimum. Once we're married and the old lady croaks, I'll divorce him and we'll be set for life. The business alone is worth $2 million plus the property portfolio." The voice on the other end was muffled, but I heard enough to know this was planned. Orchestrated. My brother was being systematically destroyed by someone he trusted completely, and our grandmother was apparently being kept sick to serve Meredith's timeline. "Make sure the next round of chemo is especially harsh," she continued. "I need her weak enough that nobody questions it when she finally dies, but not so weak that she dies before the wedding. We've come too far to mess this up now." I pulled out my phone and started recording, my hands shaking as I captured every word. "The backup plan is still the life insurance policies, right?" she asked. "If something goes wrong with the inheritance, Jake's worth $1.2 million in coverage. But the marriage route is cleaner. No investigations, no suspicious deaths to explain." I nearly dropped my phone. She was planning to kill my brother. After she hung up, I slipped into the guest bedroom and waited for her to leave the bathroom. When she finally emerged, she was back to her sweet, concerned girlfriend persona, asking my mother if there was anything she could do to help with dinner preparation. That night, I started my investigation in earnest. When Jake's college friends visited for his birthday party, Meredith would disappear with sudden, debilitating migraines that required dark rooms and complete silence. But I caught her researching his social media from the guest room, memorizing details about people she'd supposedly never met. She had spiral notebooks filled with information, inside jokes, shared memories, embarrassing college stories, career details, family connections, everything she'd need to seem like the perfect girlfriend who just happened to miss meeting his closest friends due to her chronic health issues. My headaches get so bad around large groups, she'd explain later, touching Jake's arm with practiced sympathy. All that noise and energy just overwhelms my system. I'm so sorry I couldn't meet everyone properly. Jake would feel guilty for having friends over, for planning social events, for living his life in a way that caused his girlfriend pain. I found credit reports in her purse when she asked me to grab her lip balm from her bag. Not just Jake's, his whole family's, including mine and our parents. She'd been running comprehensive background checks on all of us, mapping our financial situations like a military strategist planning an invasion. The reports were thorough, showing bank account numbers, credit scores, investment portfolios, property values, even our employment histories and salary ranges. The papers were dated 3 months before she and Jake had supposedly met by chance at a coffee shop near his office. She'd been hunting him specifically. The worst discovery came when I borrowed her laptop to print wedding invitations, claiming my printer was broken. Her browser history was a masterclass in manipulation and criminal planning. How to rush a wedding timeline. Inheritance laws by state. Making men propose faster. Signs your boyfriend's family is wealthy. How to access spouse's accounts after marriage. Digitalis poisoning symptoms. Making heart attacks look natural. Life insurance payout timelines. But the most chilling search was recent. How to trigger heart attacks in elderly cancer patients without detection. I screenshot everything, my hands shaking as I documented months of calculated deception and what appeared to be murder planning. For weeks, I gathered evidence like I was building a federal case. Photos of documents, recorded conversations, bank statements showing her mounting debts. She owed $47,000 across 7 credit cards and had 2 active judgments against her for unpaid loans, totaling another $23,000. Her car was 3 months behind on payments and scheduled for repossession. She'd been evicted from 2 apartments in the past year for non-payment of rent. Jake was her lottery ticket, and she was running out of time. I discovered she'd been married twice before, both to wealthy older men who died under suspicious circumstances. The first husband, Harold Brennan, had suffered a massive heart attack at 52 despite no prior cardiac issues. The second, Robert Martinez, had fallen down the stairs at his home at age 58, breaking his neck. Both deaths were ruled accidental after brief investigations, and both wives inherited everything: substantial life insurance policies, business assets, real estate portfolios. Meredith wasn't just a gold digger. She was a serial killer with a specific type. I tried approaching this carefully, sharing small concerns with my family first. But Meredith had already positioned herself as the victim of my jealousy and mental health struggles. When I mentioned her strange work schedule, she'd confided in my mother about her severe anxiety disorder that made regular employment difficult. When I questioned her financial contributions to their relationship, she'd tearfully explained to my father how her abusive ex-husband had destroyed her credit out of spite and left her financially devastated. "I'm so embarrassed about my situation," she'd sobbed to my parents. "Jake knows everything and accepts me anyway, but Sarah seems to think I'm some kind of gold digger just because I'm not wealthy like your family." Every concern I raised, she'd already crafted a sympathetic explanation for. She was always one step ahead, painting me as the unstable, jealous sister who couldn't handle her brother moving on. Jake was completely blind to it all. Love does that to people, especially people who've been hurt before. He was so grateful to find someone who seemed to accept him completely, who praised his kindness and success, who made him feel like a hero again after Sarah's betrayal, that he ignored every red flag I tried to point out. "She makes me feel like myself again," he'd say when I expressed concerns. "For the first time since Sarah, I'm not worried about being betrayed. Meredith's been through her own hell. She understands what it's like to have someone you trust hurt you." The irony was devastating. She was playing his trauma against him, using his fear of being hurt again to make him ignore signs that he was being hurt in exactly the same way. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made copies of everything and went to the police. Detective Morrison listened patiently as I laid out the evidence: the recordings, the financial documents, the browser history, the pattern of dead husbands. But his expression grew increasingly skeptical as I spoke. "Ma'am, being in debt isn't a crime," he said finally. "Even researching inheritance laws isn't illegal if she's planning to marry into the family." As for the previous husbands, both cases were thoroughly investigated at the time. Without concrete evidence of a current crime, this sounds like a family dispute. "She's planning to kill my brother," I insisted, "and possibly my grandmother." "The phone conversation I recorded could be interpreted multiple ways," he interrupted. "Defense attorneys are very good at creating reasonable doubt. Keep playing sick could mean a lot of things that aren't criminal." He was right, legally. But I knew what I knew. "What if she actually hurt someone?" I asked. "Then we'll investigate," he said. "But we can't arrest people for crimes they might commit based on internet searches and suspicious timing." The night before the wedding, I tried one last desperate attempt to reach my brother. "Jake, we need to talk about Meredith. Please, just listen to me for 5 minutes before you say anything." He cut me off before I could even begin, his face flushed with anger and exhaustion from wedding stress. "I'm not listening to this jealousy anymore," he said. You've been trying to sabotage us since day one. Every time I'm happy, you find something wrong with it. Sarah poisoned you against the idea of me being in a relationship. This isn't about Sarah or my feelings about your relationships. It's exactly about Sarah, he exploded, his voice echoing through his apartment. You think every woman is going to hurt me like she did? Well, guess what? Meredith isn't Sarah. She loves me for who I am, not what I have. She's been through hell herself and came out stronger. His words stung because part of them were true. I had been protective of him since his divorce, maybe overly so. But this was different. Jake, she knows about Grandma's inheritance clause. She's been planning this marriage as a business transaction. Enough! He stood up, towering over me. If you can't support my happiness, if you can't see that I found someone who genuinely cares about me, then maybe you shouldn't be at my wedding tomorrow. The threat hit like a physical blow. Jake and I had been inseparable growing up. He'd walked me to school when kids bullied me about my thick glasses and secondhand clothes. I'd helped him through his divorce, holding him while he cried over Sarah's betrayal, and promising him he'd find real love someday. The idea of losing him to someone who was planning to destroy him was unbearable, but I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I put on my bridesmaid dress, a soft lavender that Meredith had chosen because it would photograph beautifully and complement her wedding photos. I did my makeup carefully, fixed my hair into the elegant updo she'd requested, and smiled through the pre-wedding photos at her parents' house. I hugged Meredith and told her she looked absolutely stunning in her $8,000 designer dress that Jake had insisted on paying for, despite her protests. You're going to make my brother so happy, I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. I posed with the bridal party and made small talk about flowers and honeymoon plans, nodding enthusiastically when she described their planned 2-week trip to Italy, another expensive vacation that Jake was funding, all while carrying a folder of evidence carefully hidden in a specially sewn pocket inside my dress. The ceremony was held at the Riverside Country Club, Jake's dream wedding venue that he'd talked about since we were kids. 300 guests filled the elegant ballroom, business associates, college friends, extended family, and community members who'd known our family for decades. Meredith had insisted on the most expensive package: open bar, 7-course dinner, live band, elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. Every detail was designed to impress people she'd never see again after she collected her payout. As I walked down the aisle in front of the bride, carrying a bouquet of white roses and lavender that matched my dress, I caught sight of my grandmother in the front row. She looked heartbreakingly frail in her wheelchair, the cancer treatments having stolen most of her energy and nearly 40 pounds from her once robust frame. But her eyes were bright with joy as she watched her grandson's wedding, her face glowing with happiness at seeing him find love again. She had no idea she was watching her own murder plot unfold in real time. The officiant, Pastor Williams, who'd known our family for 20 years, began the ceremony with a reading from Corinthians about love being patient and kind. Jake stood at the altar looking happier than I'd seen him in years, his face glowing with genuine joy as Meredith approached in her flowing white gown. She looked like something from a fairy tale, which I suppose was exactly the point. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Jacob Michael Sterling and Meredith Ann Collins in holy matrimony, Pastor Williams began, his warm voice carrying easily through the flower-filled ballroom. My heart pounded as he continued through the traditional ceremony. This was really happening. In minutes, my brother would be legally bound to someone who was planning to kill him for money, someone who might have already murdered 2 other men. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. It signifies the mystical union between Christ and his church, and it is therefore not to be undertaken carelessly or selfishly, but thoughtfully and in the love of God. I thought about all the evidence hidden in my dress. The credit reports showing her massive debts, the browser history documenting searches for murder methods, the recorded phone conversation about keeping our grandmother sick, the pattern of dead husbands who'd all died unexpectedly after marrying her. Would anyone believe me? Would it matter if they did? Marriage is the blessed arrangement and institution ordained by God in paradise, and it has been confirmed as honorable among all men. It is therefore not to be undertaken lightly or thoughtlessly, but with reverence and in the fear of God. The irony of those words, about not undertaking marriage lightly, while watching someone who'd turned marriage into a murder weapon, wasn't lost on me. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The moment arrived faster than I expected. The traditional words that usually pass without incident in modern weddings, a formality that Pastor Williams probably hadn't seen, interrupted in his decades of performing ceremonies. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking with adrenaline and terror. I do. The church went silent so completely I could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 people turned to stare at me. I felt their shock, their confusion, their judgment washing over me in waves. Jake's face went white, then red with embarrassment and fury. Meredith's expression flickered rapidly through surprise, rage, and then quickly settled into hurt confusion, her default manipulation tactic. I object to this marriage, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room despite my trembling hands. Jake stepped forward from the altar, his face a mask of humiliation and anger. Sarah, sit down. Now. This is completely inappropriate. I can't do that, I said, reaching for the folder hidden in my dress. Everyone needs to see this. Everyone needs to know what's really happening here. Meredith's eyes locked onto the folder like a predator spotting prey, and for just a second, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. I saw pure, murderous hatred flash across her face before she composed herself and shifted into victim mode. I'm so sorry, everyone, she said to the crowd, her voice shaking with practiced emotion and tears starting to form in her eyes. Jake's sister has been struggling with some serious personal issues lately. She's been against our relationship from the very beginning, and we've tried to be understanding and supportive. Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the guests. Several people nodded knowingly, their faces showing pity for what they assumed was a family dealing with mental health struggles. It was easier to believe that explanation than the truth. Sarah has been in therapy, Jake added, trying to salvage the situation and minimize the embarrassment. She's having trouble accepting that I've moved on from my divorce and found happiness again. I walked toward the altar, opening the folder and pulling out the first document. Meredith, tell everyone about your phone call on Easter Sunday. The one where you discussed keeping our grandmother sick until after the wedding so you could inherit the family business. The color drained from Meredith's face so quickly I thought she might faint, but she recovered with impressive speed. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, she said, tears starting to flow freely now. This is my wedding day. How could you do this to me? To your own brother? Because I have it recorded, I said, pulling out my phone. Would you like me to play it for everyone? I pressed play, and her voice filled the silent church, crystal clear and unmistakably hers. The wedding has to be before his grandmother dies. That inheritance won't transfer if we're not married. The lawyers were very clear about the marriage clause. Just keep playing sick until then, and we'll split everything 60-40 like we discussed. The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations. I watched faces change from confusion to horror as the implications sank in. My grandmother clutched her chest, her face pale with understanding and betrayal. Jake stared at Meredith like he'd never seen her before, which in many ways he hadn't. I wasn't, Meredith started, but I was already pulling out more evidence, spreading papers across the altar like I was laying out a case for a jury. Here are her credit reports showing $47,000 in active debt across multiple accounts, I announced, holding up the documents. Here's her browser history, documenting months of research into our family's finances, inheritance laws, and murder methods. Here are records of her 2 previous marriages to wealthy men who both died under suspicious circumstances shortly after their weddings. I spread the papers across the altar, creating an undeniable display of evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as jealousy. She didn't meet you by accident, Jake, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I saw doubt creeping into his expression. She's been tracking our family for months, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. You're not her first target. And if this marriage happened, you wouldn't be her last victim. Jake picked up one of the credit reports with trembling hands, scanning the numbers that told the story of Meredith's desperate financial situation. Meredith? Is this real? These debts? These dates? She was trapped, her carefully constructed lies crumbling in real time as hundreds of people watched. But Meredith was a survivor who'd perfected her craft over years of deception, and survivors adapt quickly when cornered. Okay, yes, she said, dropping the innocent act entirely, and speaking in a voice I'd never heard from her before. Cold, calculating, completely different from the sweet girlfriend persona. I researched your family before we started dating, but that's just being smart in today's world. Everyone does background checks on people they're going to commit to. It doesn't mean I don't love him. You told us you'd never been married before, Jake said quietly, his voice hollow with betrayal. I said my previous relationships didn't work out, she replied with a shrug. That's technically true. Death is the ultimate relationship failure. 2 husbands died, Meredith, both mysteriously, both wealthy, both shortly after marrying you. She actually laughed, a sound completely unlike any laugh she'd ever made around our family. It was harsh, bitter, and utterly without warmth. Mysteriously? She mocked. Harold had a heart attack because he was 300 pounds and lived on nothing but bacon and whiskey. Robert fell downstairs because he was drunk 20 hours a day and could barely walk straight. If that's mysterious, then every widow in America should be under investigation. The cold calculation in her voice, the casual way she dismissed the deaths of men she'd supposedly loved, was terrifying. This was who she really was underneath the sweet, vulnerable act, a predator who viewed human lives as business opportunities. My father stepped forward from the front row, his face red with anger. Young lady, I think you need to leave. Immediately. I'm not going anywhere, Meredith snapped, her mask completely gone now. This is my wedding, and these are lies being spread by a jealous, mentally unstable woman who can't handle her brother moving on with his life. Then explain the phone conversation, I challenged, holding up my phone again. Explain planning to keep our grandmother sick until after the wedding. Explain discussing splitting Jake's inheritance with someone. For the first time since I'd known her, Meredith had no immediate answer. She looked around the room, possibly calculating her options or looking for escape routes, then seemed to make a decision. Fine, she said with venom, pulling off her engagement ring and throwing it at Jake's feet where it clinked against the marble floor. You want to believe your psychotic sister over me? Go ahead. But you're making the biggest mistake of your life. She started walking toward the back of the church, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. But she stopped at the door and turned back, her face twisted with rage. Jake, when you realize what you've lost, don't come looking for me, she snarled. And when your precious sister destroys every relationship you ever try to have because she can't stand to see you happy with anyone, remember this moment. Remember that you chose her mental illness over my love. She walked out, and nearly half the guests followed her, some supporting her, others just eager to witness more drama in the parking lot, or simply wanting to escape the uncomfortable situation. Jake stood among the scattered papers, still holding her credit report, surrounded by the ruins of what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. His dream wedding had become a public nightmare in front of everyone he knew and respected. Jake, I said softly, approaching him carefully like he might bolt. I'm so sorry it happened this way, but don't. He held up his hand, his voice hollow. Just Don't say anything right now. I can't. I need a minute to process this. Pastor Williams, clearly shaken by the most dramatic ceremony of his career, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should move this conversation to somewhere more private. My parents, Jake and I, ended up in the country club's manager's office while the remaining guests were directed to the reception hall for drinks and whatever explanation the staff could provide. Jake sat in a leather chair, still in his tuxedo, staring at the evidence spread across the mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I started suspecting things at Easter when I overheard that phone call, but I've been actively gathering evidence for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He nodded slowly, like he was trying to make sense of a timeline that didn't match his reality. "And you didn't think to tell me any of this?" "I tried," I said, frustration bleeding into my voice. "Every time I brought up concerns, you said I was jealous or mentally unstable. You threatened to uninvite me from the wedding when I tried to talk to you last night." Dad picked up the recording device, turning it over in his hands. "Son, this is pretty damning evidence. The phone conversation alone suggests she was planning something terrible." "I know what it suggests." Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. I need to understand how I got this so completely wrong. Again, how do I keep choosing women who want to destroy me?" My mother sat beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Honey, this isn't your fault. She's clearly a professional at this kind of manipulation." "A professional what? Con artist? Serial killer? How do I keep falling for people who see me as a target instead of a person?" The pain in his voice broke my heart. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, that even saving him would somehow damage him further, that exposing Meredith's deception would make him question his own judgment about everyone. "You didn't choose this," I said firmly. "She chose you. She researched you, studied you, tracked you down, and manipulated you with surgical precision. Nothing about your relationship was real or random or based on your choices." Detective Morrison arrived an hour later. I'd called him before the ceremony, asking him to be on standby in case my objection actually worked and we needed law enforcement. He interviewed all of us, reviewed the evidence with the serious attention it deserved, and made several phone calls to colleagues in other states. "The deaths of her previous husbands are being reopened as active investigations," he told us after finishing his calls. "And we're looking at multiple fraud charges related to the false identity documents she used to research your family's finances and the identity theft involved in obtaining your credit reports." "False identity?" Jake looked up with confusion. "Meredith Ann Collins isn't her real name," Detective Morrison explained. "She's actually Michelle Carter, and she has an extensive record of small-time cons going back 15 years. Marriage fraud, credit card scams, insurance claims, identity theft. She's been building up to bigger targets as her skills improved." Jake was quiet for a long time after Detective Morrison left to coordinate with other agencies. Finally, he looked directly at me. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life," he said. "Not just for today, but for weeks of dismissing your concerns and calling you crazy." "You don't owe me anything," I replied. "You're my brother. Protecting you is my job. Even when I'm being a complete idiot who won't listen to reason, especially then." We spent the rest of the evening in the hotel bar, still in our wedding attire, getting progressively drunker while Jake processed the reality of his near miss. Some of the wedding guests joined us, curious about the dramatic turn of events and wanting to make sure Jake was okay. By midnight, it had turned into an oddly festive gathering, a celebration of a bullet dodged rather than a marriage celebrated. "You know what the worst part is?" Jake said around 1 a.m., loosening his bow tie and looking more relaxed than he had in months. "I actually thought I was getting better at judging people. After Sarah, I promised myself I'd be more careful, more observant, more aware of red flags. And instead, I picked someone even worse. Sarah was a cheater and a thief," I pointed out. "But she wasn't planning to murder you for your life insurance. There's a significant difference in the level of evil we're talking about here." "Yeah, one's more creative than the other," he said with dark humor. Our cousin David, who'd stayed for the impromptu reception, raised his glass. "Here's to Sarah for saving Jake's life and probably his inheritance. Here's to families who don't give up on each other even when it's hard," Jake corrected, clinking his glass against mine. 3 weeks later, Detective Morrison called with major updates. Meredith Michelle had been arrested in Las Vegas while attempting to marry a casino owner using yet another false identity. The investigations into her previous husbands had uncovered evidence of digitalis poisoning in both cases, a plant-based toxin that mimics heart attack symptoms and is nearly undetectable without specific testing. She was facing multiple charges of murder in the first degree, fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft across 4 states. Jake had his locks changed and hired a private security company after receiving several threatening phone calls from an unknown number that we all assumed was Meredith calling from jail. He also started therapy with a specialist in trauma and manipulation to work through what he called his broken picker when it came to relationships. "I need to understand why I'm attracted to people who want to hurt me," he told me after his first session. "There has to be something I'm missing, some pattern I'm not seeing." 6 months later, our grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family who loved her. Jake inherited the family business as intended, but more importantly, he was alive to receive it and honor her memory. At her funeral, he squeezed my hand during the service. "She would have been heartbroken to know what almost happened," he whispered. "She would have been proud that family protected family," I whispered back. A year later, Jake started dating Emma, a 3rd-grade teacher from the elementary school near his house. She was kind, genuine, financially independent, and had her own career and life goals. More importantly, when Jake told her about what had happened with Meredith, she was horrified rather than impressed, which seemed like an excellent sign for his recovery. "I'm going to need you to investigate her too," Jake joked when he first brought Emma to Sunday dinner. "Already did a preliminary background check," I replied with a grin. "Clean credit history, stable employment for 6 years, no mysterious dead husbands, And she insisted on paying for her own coffee on your first date. You're good to go. You actually ran a background check? Emma asked, laughing. After what happened, I'm running background checks on everyone who comes within 10 feet of my family, I said. It's nothing personal. It's completely personal, Emma replied. And I respect that. Family should protect family. As for me, I learned that sometimes protecting the people you love means risking their anger, resentment, and even their relationship with you. I learned that family loyalty isn't just about supporting each other's choices. Sometimes it's about refusing to support them when those choices are dangerous, even if that refusal causes pain in the short term. And I learned that standing up in front of 300 people and destroying a wedding is simultaneously the most terrifying and most necessary thing I've ever done in my life. Jake and Emma got engaged this past Christmas. They're planning a small ceremony next spring, just immediate family and close friends at our parents' house. Jake asked me to be his best man instead of a traditional bridesmaid. I need someone who'll speak up if anything seems wrong, he said when he asked. Always, I promised. That's what family is for. Meredith Michelle was convicted on 2 counts of murder in the first degree and multiple fraud charges across 4 states. She's serving life without the possibility of parole in a maximum security facility. Her appeals have all been denied. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed silent that day, if I'd let the wedding proceed and hoped for the best, if I'd chosen to avoid conflict rather than cause a scene. But then I look at my brother, alive, happy, and building a healthy relationship with someone who genuinely loves him for who he is. And I know I made the right choice. Family protects family, even when it's messy and uncomfortable and humiliating, even when it means standing up at an altar and destroying everything in front of hundreds of people, even when it costs you temporary relationships and social standing. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone you care about destroy themselves, even if they hate you for it in the moment.